Alright guys, so this is our second set of notes into the Civil War, and really we're still in the pre-Civil War stage of this class. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Dred Scott decision. This is Dred Scott versus Sandford. This is the Supreme Court decision that ruled that slaves should be treated as property, and they could not sue because they were not citizens. And it basically strikes down the Missouri Compromise, along with the Compromise of 1850, which is the same thing. So essentially the background of this case is Dred Scott's owner had taken him into a free state, a free territory. Dred Scott sues for his freedom, claiming that there was no slavery allowed in the territory, therefore his owner could not lawfully keep him enslaved there. So the Supreme Court came back with an extremely racist position, basically stating that black people were so far inferior to whites that they basically didn't have to have any kind of respect to their rights whatsoever, including provisions that possibly could lead to freed blacks becoming enslaved in the future. So basically, it was wildly pro-slavery. And this is one of those little flaws to the Supreme Court and how the appointments work. Justice Taney, who is this man right there, right in the center, he's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he got to author the opinion. And because they served for life, Taney was appointed a long time before this case came out, so he brings in those long, even for that time period, more prejudiced views about race and everything else, and he's also from the South. So, and I believe he actually owned slaves prior to joining the Supreme Court. So this guy was a straight-up racist. There's no nice way to talk about it. What you might be wondering is based on the appearance of Dred Scott over here and the fact that he looks a little older. Well, why did he wait till now to sue? Well, basically the story goes, and there's a little bit of back and forth on this because it's not, the historical record is not perfect on it. Essentially, it was his owner was fairly notorious about engaging in sexual improprieties with his slaves at the time, and Dred Scott had a daughter and did not want his daughter to go through that, so he sued for his freedom and did not win. Now, the reason why this case matters is it essentially makes the entire country potentially a slave-based country because, in theory, even a freed African-American person up north, he can be thrown back into slavery based on Taney's opinion in this case. So it's basically lights a fire up under the North because all of a sudden they realize, oh, this is now everybody that's around us, free blacks in Massachusetts and places like New York where there's a lot of free blacks in the society. All of a sudden now they're in trouble. They could be, it turns a lot of people who were kind of indifferent or at least kind of put it out of their minds, turn them into full-blown abolitionists in many cases. All right, and then you have the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This is a series of debates for the U.S. Senate in Illinois. So it's kind of strange. It's not just because of Abraham Lincoln being involved in this. So this isn't discussed just because he becomes president later on. These debates and what they were talking about even back then was very famous. This is a series of debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. He's the little guy on the right. During the senatorial election of 1858 in Illinois, the topic of slavery was the primary issue because all the new territories were discussing whether or not they would become slave or free states. And here's some images from them. This was a heavily publicized and heavily tracked series of debates. Like the whole country was reading about these things. And you got Abraham Lincoln, who is the first, who's an early Republican. He's coming out and saying slavery bad, don't let it expand. He's not going slavery is morally wrong, like it's a sin, it's a moral sin and terrible for the world. He's doing it on the basis of it's bad economically. So Abraham Lincoln is not the great emancipator yet. He is not the guy who has flipped on the notion of slavery being just inherently morally wrong. He kind of evolves in that later. He's the Republican. Stephen Douglas is the little guy in the little statue right here where they juxtapose those two just to point out how different the height was. He is the Democrat, and he is not really pro-slavery. He's a Northern Democrat. Most Northern Democrats, even they weren't really that big into slavery. However, they did not want to have abolition in part because they represented folks up north who believed that if they suddenly freed the slaves, they'd all rush north and they'd take the work from the white folks. So they were not, while they were not pro-slavery, they were not pro-abolition by any means either. And you'd think, because you would hope the way things work out is the anti-slavery guy wins. He doesn't. Lincoln actually loses this election, and he's considered to have lost the debates at the time. And remember, they were publicized heavily at the time. And there's some more pictures of what they looked like at the time. This is Abraham Lincoln without the beard. He later grows that at the recommendation of someone who said they thought he'd look nicer with a beard, and he took the lady's advice. All right, Stephen Douglas wins the debate at that time with this argument called the Freeport Doctrine. It said that if the territory did not have slave laws, then it could not have slaves. And the whole argument was based on the 10th Amendment, which we'll look at in just a moment. But it's this notion that, well, even if at the national level slavery is legal, at the state level, due to federalism and states' rights, states can choose not to have them, therefore there's no slavery. That was his argument, and basically what he's doing there is trying to make a popular sovereignty-based argument that states can vote and decide what they want, and later territories can vote and decide what they want. And here before I get to the 10th Amendment, we'll look very quickly. Notice they're all doing this all by coach, train, and horseback all through Illinois. This is a very compact schedule of debates, and they're just going up and down all over Illinois trying to basically explain their cause. And slavery, again, is at the forefront of all these issues. And it's not called the Freeport Doctrine because of an actual, freedom argument. It's based on this. At the second stop right here, this is where he comes up and, uses the Freeport Doctrine most famously. All right, now, the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment declares that all powers not granted specific to the federal government or prohibited from the states is given the states automatically. The best example in the modern era for this is there's nothing in the Constitution of the United States about education. Therefore, education is handled completely by the states. Another example would be driver's licenses. There's nothing in the Constitution about licensing outside of copyrights, licensing or driving, so guess what? The states get to handle that because it's not mentioned and it's not prohibited, therefore the states get it. Well, back at that time, that became the issue with slavery. There was nothing in the Constitution that talks about certain slave laws. There were no slave codes in the Constitution itself. They mentioned slavery in the terms all other persons when it comes to census numbers, but they don't actually explicitly mention slavery. They mention recovery of property when slaves were considered property back then, but they don't mention slavery in particular, which means because they don't mention slavery, slavery is technically within the province of the states to decide matters of law and legality. So every state started making their own laws with regards to slavery. Up north, they started making what they called liberty laws, which basically were things that made it illegal for any law enforcement officer at the state or city level in that state. So let's say New York makes a liberty law. Well, that means no New York police officer or New York sheriff's deputy or New York law enforcement agent of any kind can enforce slave laws, meaning they can't go catch them, they can't imprison a runaway slave, that kind of stuff. Only the feds could do that. Now, at the other end, in the South, they can establish a thing called slave codes, and that's what we're going to go over next. Slave codes were codes put in place to control and restrict the actions of slaves and grant amnesty for owners who killed slaves during punishment, set the parameters of defining what a slave was. It also regulated how slaves and free whites could interact with each other. The primary purpose of these codes was to keep African slaves down. There's no other way to look at it. They were just for that single purpose, because they were afraid of slave insurrection and uprising. These codes would restrict things like what slaves could marry each other. They'd restrict how they interact with free whites in church, or if they could go to church at all. They would restrict things like this number of slaves cannot congregate in an area for longer than blank minutes. Basically trying to prevent plotting from happening. They were so scared because of things like the Stoner Rebellion. They got Nat Turner's Rebellion wasn't all that long ago. All these things have happened in recent memory, and they wanted to make all these laws to make it virtually impossible for slaves to plot and plan anything, including their own abolition or self-emancipation and escape. So they were basically trying to stop all that from happening. And that's basically the end of it. So we've gone from Dred Scott v. Sanford, talking about the main issue that slavery could basically be expanded north and south, all the way down to the slave codes and the 10th Amendment and the major debates that were happening during this time period. So that should take care of you for this day's set of notes, and I'll see you tomorrow when we set up the next ones.